This is Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell. Well, the news coming out of India sometimes has been pretty shocking when it comes to news about women. We've read about the Uber rape. There's been, of course, a couple of years ago, this bus rape in Delhi. There's also been the issue of forced sterilization and the women who died from poisoning and forced sterilization. It's just been one thing after another. And we're going to talk about women's issues in India with Manisha Gupte, and she's been active in the women's movement there since the mid-'70s. She co-founded an organization that's acronym is MASOOM. It's a rural women's organization in the Indian state of Maharashtra, and she did that in 1987, and she works on child marriage issues with Jewish World Service. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here.
Could you explain a little about what's happening? Because I think a lot of people are surprised when they hear all this news from India about women, and it's so bad all the time. Mm-hmm. What's going on?
It's true. It's terrible. What happened in the Uber, taxi, all the situations that you talked about, really terrible. They cannot be condemned enough. And the women's movement is very strong, so they will take up that issue. And as the rape and death 2 years ago, December 16th, 2 years ago, happened, the women's movement basically put so much pressure. The government had to set up the Verma Commission, which was a very progressive commission. And Justice Verma came up with graded sexual assault, defining not rape just as a patriarchal peno-vaginal rape, but, kind of different kinds of sexual assault. And so the women's movement was really heard. Maybe something, will come out that is better, not just banning Uber. Or I heard that maybe they're going to come down upon web access to taxis. I mean, it's ridiculous. I would say that, the rape happened because a woman is traveling alone. A woman is actually being able to book a taxi on her own. And a rape happens at night because a woman is out at night. And so in a sense, it's an indicator of how many women are out there. And we have to create safe spaces and not push women back into their homes because something like this happens.
It is funny to see the solution become something like, well, we'll ban Uber because of this. They don't want to change the attitudes. They want to change the structures. Mm-hmm.
That's true. When women start coming into public spaces, they are in men's faces. With the artificial divide between private and public, which we really know doesn't exist because, both patriarchies actually help each other to consolidate power in the hands of men and keep women in subordinated positions in both the spheres. What we really need to do is to change people's attitude and say that men and women have equal access and should have equal rights in both the public and the private space. And my daughter has the right to be outside at night. My son has the right to be outside at night. But nobody has the right to violate anyone else's right to be outside at night. So I think this is the attitude that we need to change. Working class women have always been outside. They've never had the luxury to be inside home. But now as middle and upwardly mobile women get out on the streets at night, I think that really affects a certain group of people who in this globalized world where they think that they should be the ones who should actually be moving up, find that women are moving up much faster. And because they cannot challenge the structures, the easy target then becomes a single woman who's out on the streets. So I see this as a individual violation, but I also see this as a symptom of something that's going wrong in terms of people's aspirations not being met by being in India in 2014 or 2015.
What role do men have to play here? Do men have to change some of their mindsets about what's going on here, that women in public places are acceptable or that all times of day and night? What kind of thing has to go through men's minds?
I want to start off with a poster that was held in one of the marches in the rape 2 years ago. It says, "Don't teach me how to dress, teach your son not to rape." And so therefore we have to start telling people that a woman is not responsible for rape. It's not that because the woman was at the wrong place at the wrong time. There is no wrong place and there is no wrong time. And therefore we have to teach men to share spaces. What has happened is that women have come out, but men have not really engaged with the private sphere. And so they don't interact with women in terms of gender roles of helping their wives, their mothers, their sisters at home. And I think when all spaces are shared, and all spaces become respectful for both, I think that's the time that men will start realizing that we are really comrades, we are not against each other, and that we are different but we are equal. I think that is what we need to work with. And we can't just start when, men have already become perpetrators, because then the whole dialogue is different. We have to start when boys are young, when they haven't committed violence, because there's nothing wrong with being a boy, as there is nothing wrong with being a girl. They're equally precious. They come from the same place and they have to coexist. And if they're able to coexist peacefully, I'm not necessarily speaking in terms of heterosexual marriage, but I'm saying that on this planet we have to coexist. And if we coexisted well, then we wouldn't have to specifically teach gender equality. But people would realize through their words and actions that it's a nice place at home and outside if we're all equal.
Manisha Gupte is with the organization Masoom. It's a rural women's organization she founded in 1987. Now, it's interesting that we saw this news story about sterilization, women's sterilization. And for a lot of people, it probably surprised them. And there were statistics out there like 37% of all women's sterilizations are performed in India. Mm-hmm. And why is that?
Shall I be very frank? It's because of Western funding that we were pushed into a very coercive family planning program, and that India was the first state that officially accepted the Indian family planning program in 1950. A lot of aid from the global north came to us tied with sterilizations, came tied with contraceptives. Sometimes we got grants in the form of shiploads of contraceptives. Now you have to see India differently. We don't have a religious sanction against contraceptives. There is no religious sanction against abortion per se. But we have a growing population. Now, the whole issue is whether overpopulation is the cause of poverty or whether it's the effect of poverty. And that is the unending debate between Marx and Malthus, where Marx says that overpopulation is a result of poverty and Malthus says that, it's the cause of poverty. And I would say that, what our health minister said in Bucharest in 1974 at the World Population Conference, that development is the best contraceptive. Because we find that our grandparents had many more children than our parents had. And the angst of our generation at this point is that our children probably will never have children. And that is because people realize that children are not necessarily your only assets. It's when you don't have anything else in life that you want to have more children, or they may not survive. And that's why people have more children. Now, in India, what we had in 1975 to 1977 during the internal emergency, there were hundreds of thousands of forced vasectomies. That's the sterilization of men. Right. And that boomerangs so much that the government doesn't want to touch vasectomies, and that goes very well with patriarchy. So basically what happens is a girl gets sterilized at 20. Most of our rural girls are sterilized at 20 or 21.
So most of the forced vasectomies in the 70s were men.
Yes.
And now they don't want men. Yeah. Men don't want that anymore.
Yes. There were men, there were poor men, there were Dalit men, there were Muslim men. And so that whole program just boomeranged. It was Mrs. Indira Gandhi's son Sanjay Gandhi who actually had the most coercive family planning program. And so therefore in sterilizations, if there's a camp rather than, a woman accessing sterilization on her own, which is safe, then this was, we don't know whether it was zinc, whether it was phosphorus, we don't know whether it was, drugs that went wrong. Now they're just passing the buck from one to the other. Now, but the fact is that when women went there for sterilization, some of them at least went for a better aspiration. And some might have gone because of the incentive. But they went there for a better life, not to die.
Why is it that women are the ones getting sterilized when it's such a more complicated procedure? Yes. I understand the kickback from that. Why not provide the incentive to the men now? I've heard that it's because people can't be taught about contraception because they're illiterate and they want to just cut to the chase and get some contraception in there.
See, what happens is that when you get pushed, if you don't have the politics of understanding why you're being pushed, you find it easier to shove somebody below you. And then you feel that you got some space. And then the person below you then pushes somebody else below you. So when that pressure reaches the home, then who is easier to sacrifice? When the health worker is constantly bullying you and saying, when are you going to get sterilized? We have disincentives for more than 2 children. People cannot contest political office if they have more than 2 children. No maternity benefits. Now, maternity benefits are not available anyway to more than 2% of the population in India because the women are mostly in the unorganized sector. Rather than universalize that, you take away the 2% that is, already, it's not a privilege, it's not a favor that we, have maternity benefits. Then, subsidized food won't be available as though the child doesn't, feel hungry. So this is the situation in which we are, and then women are the ones that get sacrificed for the sterilization. Now what happens is that, how does this become a cultural norm? Women feel that it's much better that I get sterilized because tomorrow if I get pregnant, the legitimacy of my child won't get questioned. Because if there is a failed vasectomy, then if she gets pregnant, people are not going to say, poor Manisha. They're going to say, how did she get pregnant? And they might even question the paternity of my earlier children. So it can go back. Many times health workers don't know that they have to tell people after vasectomy that they must use a condom for 3 to 6 months. Because the stock of sperms is already left the testicles and it's sitting elsewhere. So a lot of women get pregnant after vasectomy because they haven't been told. And suddenly, how did you get pregnant? Then there's also the myth that, you might not be able to have enjoyable sexuality after vasectomy. So people have to be told that, no, you will have the same sexual pleasure. It's just that there won't be any sperm that leaves your body. All these things are not told. And then a man also wants to keep his reproductive career open because should something happen to the children, then he can have other children, but a woman cannot. And so therefore really that becomes the pressure. And because until sterilization everything is free, contraceptives are free, sterilization is free in India. So that is the reason why the poorest get pushed. So for example, if I'm middle class and I want to have a sterilization after 2 children, a doctor won't perform it on me. He or she will tell me to wait for 5 years and come back after 5 years. But that's not the same for my rural friend.
It seems unfair to have these different standards.
It is, of course it's unfair.
Terribly.
It's criminal, it's unfair.
If you could fix this situation, what would you do?
One would work, of course, with women. One would work on all health rights so that sterilization is not siloed and it's not separate from reproductive and sexual rights of women. And that reproductive and sexual rights are not siloed and they are not different from comprehensive and universally accessible high-quality healthcare. So as the health movement, we are fighting for the right to health to become a universal and fundamental right, and that high-quality healthcare is available to all, irrespective of the capacity to pay at the point of accessing healthcare. So, and not through insurance, because that only makes some people rich. The premium grows with me using insurance, and the hospitals grow by charging me double because I have insurance. So we are talking of a taxation policy through which then healthcare for everybody is taken care of, and strengthening of our public health services rather than the burgeoning private sector that is largely uncontrolled, and definitely not privatization of our health services. That's happening by the day. As we speak, health services are being privatized. They're becoming unaffordable to people. And even within the government sector, there are certain departments that are getting privatized. So like, for example, a CAT scan or an MRI would be privatized within a government hospital.
You're listening to Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell, speaking with Manisha Gupte, and she's been active in the women's movement in India since the 70s, and she's co-founder of Masoom. It's a rural women's organization in Maharashtra. And tell us about your organization. What is it that you do there?
Well, Masoom is an acronym which means without malice, clean of heart. It stands for Mahila Sarvangeen Utkarsh Mandal, which translated into English means Women's Forum for Integrated Development. We believe in collective and democratic action. So I would say that we are socialist feminists with a Gandhian heart. So we don't use the tools of the oppressor because we believe that then we become like the oppressor. But we democratize and we have collective action. So people from subordinated castes might be very lonely, or a young daughter-in-law may be at the bottom of the totem pole. But if there are 100 daughters-in-law standing out there, then they're a very big force. So we work with people We don't work on behalf of people. And we have various themes. To give you an example, one theme would be addressing the intersections of patriarchy with other systems of domination. And obviously caste, class, sexuality, homophobia, all these would be part of that understanding. And we have different programs. We have women's right to emotional and physical well-being, or women's right to a life free of violence, discrimination and fear, etc. But all these programs are connected with each other. So when a woman comes to our health center and she has white discharge, then we will talk to her about relationships at home. Or if she comes and she has a bruise, then of course we talk about domestic violence. Identification of cervical cancer at the village level in less than $0.1 by our health workers who are local would also be connected with asking questions at the public health services to ask, show us the drug list, why is the doctor not on duty today? And the domestic violence program would include women's group landing up at a woman's house if there's a risk of suicide or homicide and giving her shelter. A youth rights program would include, among other things, intervening in child or early marriage, but also not just that, but in terms of aspirations of young people and where they want to be. So it's a robust community-based program where we work with men not out of an instrumentalist approach or, they're the necessary evil, but we believe that it's intrinsic for men and women to realize that we are all human, and only when we are human we can fight for human rights. So that is basically what Masoom does, and we work in drought-prone regions in 3 blocks, you can call them counties, of 2 districts of Maharashtra, but we also do trainings all over the country.
Now, drought-prone areas, are these a lot of farmers, or have there been suicides in these areas?
Not what they're called farmer suicides in our areas. Farmer suicides is very much a globalization phenomenon, where seeds have come in from outside, where how to grow them and the fertilizers and the pesticides have come from outside. And those are not necessarily local crops, and they have taken loans for that. So it's usually the middle or the slightly big farmer that has taken these loans and found that cannot repay them because you don't know whether there'll be rain or not. And then suddenly you are in such huge debt. Your land is sometimes not now good for any other cultivation. So many of these farmers' deaths have happened in the eastern part of Maharashtra. Again, that's very gendered, because if a woman farmer commits suicide, it doesn't come under farmer suicides. Then she's just the farmer's widow. Yeah, that has repercussions on the compensation she'll get or not get because the farm didn't belong to her.
You're listening to Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell, and I'm speaking with Manisha Gupte, and we're talking about her organization, Masoom. It's a rural women's organization that does a whole lot of different things in the Indian state of Maharashtra. She's been active in the women's movement in India since the 1970s. Now, you work on child marriages with American Jewish World Service. Can you explain how you address a situation like child marriage? Because it's pretty complicated.
It's very, very complex. And I think what we're trying to do at this point is to show the complexity. We don't want to jump in with simple answers. And we really appreciate the American Jewish World Service for not forcing us to come up with simple answers, because sometimes we know the path to hell is sometimes paved with good intentions. But so if we come up with simple answers, we might actually go against the protagonist. So child marriage happens, but it's
against the law.
It's against the law, which is a gendered law. 18 for girls and 21 for boys. So the boy can vote at the national elections at 18 but can't decide about his marriage at 18. So it's a woman whose body must be ripe to have a baby and a boy who should be able to provide for his bride and children. So therefore illegality can be one is 17, the other is 20, one is 18, so it's very complex. Now, the picture that people have when they think of child marriage, about a 5-year-old marrying a 50-year-old, that's not true. Largely, it's 2 teenagers getting married. And they're trying to become friends, but they're also fighting. And those fights can have fatal consequences for their marriage. Because if the girl is asked to leave the home, get out of my house. Then, even if he wants her back, families have egos. We sent her, she came back, they sent you back. We won't send you until they come and, beg forgiveness. Or she's the bride. Why should we go and bring her back? Sometimes the marriage can just break down because of that one fight. So, child marriage definitely is not only illegal, which it should be, it's also unethical because it completely closes people's opportunities of becoming or doing what they want to do. And that happens for both boys and girls. Children should not be in labor, they should not be in sex work, they should not be in marriages, they should not be in religious institutions. They should be all given the opportunity to become who they are. So actually what we prefer, we say that it's early marriage that we need to work with. So early marriage is one day earlier than what you wanted to get married. So even you could be 25, 30, 35. You don't want to get married, it's an early marriage.
How does early marriage work with arranged marriages? Because most marriages in India are arranged, and that really complicates the situation, and in a way it drives early marriages.
Yes. I mean, I who had a marriage of choice or didn't have an arranged marriage and didn't, have a religious marriage, or my parents who married outside caste with their own choice and had a registered marriage are not the rule in India. And so therefore, if, you for a moment you accept the logic of an arranged marriage, which I don't condone, and a marriage within caste, which I condemn, but within a caste, you get married only within a certain subcaste. And there are only those many kinships within which you get married. So at any given time, there are only those many eligible boys or girls. So who gets there fastest and who gets the best bridegroom or bride for their children? The ones who go there fastest. And if you get somebody, a boy who's younger, then the dowry will be less, because once he finishes medical school, you might not be able to afford him. So that's why parents don't go out of their way to harm their children, but they think what they're doing is good for their children, though it may not be good for their children. But parents don't even know what the options could be if they didn't get their children married at that time. So actually that's the problem.
There's just a lot of pressure to do it early because you get the right person.
Right. And very rarely are people pulled by their hair into the marriage hall. But that unasked question is bouncing off the walls. You're young, you're pretty, you look so fresh. Where will you get such a good, proposal again? And it keeps coming. And once we see one boy, then all aunties and uncles want to bring proposals. So at some point, the boy or the girl say, okay, I'll go ahead with it, not realizing that actually they're leading themselves into a maze through which they may not always find an exit. So therefore, we believe that not only it's the question of a child or early marriage, but in Masum, we believe that people first must have the right to decide if they want to marry. Why should we assume that marriage is non-negotiable in people's lives? And if people want to marry, then whom they want to marry, how they want to marry, when they want to marry, and for how long they want to marry. Because unless we have a safe exit plan for people, people cannot walk out with dignity and with human rights and with mutual respect for each other. We are just going to push people inside and they stay in unhappy. If you get married early or as a child, it further complicates the situation because you don't know what your gender identity is entirely, you don't know your sexual preference. And many times it might be easier for a boy to walk out of a marriage, but not so much for a girl, especially if there's a baby. And so what we have to do at this point is to postpone the marriage. And then within that window that we get, which could sometimes be 3 months, in a drought area it could be 3 years because there may be no good year for the next 2-3 years, then use that time to consolidate young people's agency and to talk to the community.
How does that conversation go? How do you put yourself in that place where you can talk about this? I mean, it's a delicate moment in somebody's life. It's a big decision, and you have to get right in there.
Well, we've worked in the community for 27 years. So when I told you about the cervical cancer, they've seen that women didn't die of cancer for many years, cervical cancer. They've seen their sisters access our health services. They've seen their sisters access programs against domestic violence. Women are in political, offices now. Over $200,000 get distributed in loans every year. So those loans are going into homes. They're seeing children get much smarter. So there's that kind of goodwill. And we start working with children when they're in grade 3. By grade 5, they're in children's councils. So they're in bringing children who dropped out back to school. They're talking of corporal punishment. They're raising issues of sexual harassment in the school, etc. So these are the kids that come to our youth groups. And our son is the fulcrum because our daughter will get married and leave because of patriarchality of marriage. And our daughter-in-law who comes has not been part of our children's group and youth group. So our son is actually essentially a very important person because he has to fight for the rights of his sister, who's our daughter, and his wife, who's our daughter-in-law. And if we are able to empower young people, then we can simulate situations of what are the things you would like to tell your parents if they say marry somebody. So you don't cry, you don't, start shivering. You have not only mom and dad, but you have uncles, aunties, grandparents, granduncle, neighbors. You can't confront all those people alone. But if you know that you have thought these issues out and you have discussed them with your friends, then you're able to negotiate better. Now with smartphones, with everything, you're able to bring data and evidence to show that I can do this course. I can leave the village. Mom, don't worry. Or, dad will tell grandmom that we can't pull her out of 14th grade of education. She must do 15th because only then she gets an undergrad degree. So there are lots of alliances. There's somebody in that family who will stand by her or by him. And we have to start with that person. But we don't intervene unless asked for. We try to create that kind of agency among young people to be able to negotiate with parents. And then as parents postpone that marriage, then we start working with parents on what the different opportunities could be.
I'm speaking with Manisha Gupte, and she is the co-founder of Masum, a rural women's organization in Maharashtra in India. And tell us more about yourself. You talked a little about your parents there, and your parents married out of caste. It sounds like they had a rebellious streak in them.
My grandfather was a freedom fighter, as were my parents independently where they were. And they both met in the trade union. So they were both members of the Socialist Party. They were Social Democrats. And they were honest. They walked the talk. And so therefore we saw no discrepancy in what my father especially, he stayed in trade union until the end of his life. My mother left because, there was absolutely no money on his trade union leader's home. And he was the national secretary of a union that had 4 million membership. But he was such a wonderful person. He did things that, very few people in patriarchy at that time would do, like the house was in my mother's name, for example, in 1950. So I grew up in osmosis with all these ideas. But my moment of truth came during the internal emergency when I was an undergrad student on a campus.
And that was martial law in the 70s?
Not martial law. It was the internal emergency. Yeah. And it was just suspension of civil liberties. There was a 20-point program. And basically, bureaucrats had to abide by a certain way of functioning where people couldn't gather beyond a certain number without a particular reason. Whereas we said these forced sterilizations of poor and marginalized people happened, and political speeches were not allowed. And you had a risk of being arrested. Now, our Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, was very strong and internationally a very, very important person, got insecure. And I think when you get insecure, then you get a bit scared, and that fear reflects in wanting to control somebody. She had done some wonderful things, like she, kind of cancelled the privy purses of the princes overnight. She nationalized banks overnight. I mean, when she thought of something, she just went ahead and did that. She was, friends with all the pariah national, movements in the world. I mean, she just stood her ground. And I respect her tremendously for that. But this was one big mistake. And her son actually was the one who, Sanjay Gandhi, who did this terrible, terrible stuff of displacing poor people, just throwing them away across the river or sterilizing. And so we were very active. My home was a hub for cyclo-styling material. People who were, on the run were staying with us and doing wall painting at night. And we were right in the thick of things. So that's the time that I met my partner. And we were organizing, and fortunately it was only 19 months when in our entire history since 1947 of freedom from British colonization that we've had suspension of civil liberties. Then both of us got married in 1982. And then Gandhi, as well as, Jayaprakash Narayan, who was our political mentor, said, go to the villages, be humble, listen to people, don't act on their behalf, walk with people. And so we decided to go and live in a village. So we went for 5 years. 5 years, I don't know why, but it seemed enough time to understand village society, but not so long that we created a fiefdom, a place of pilgrimage where people came and said, what wonderful work, and went back. We wanted to create leadership from subordinated groups. And that would have to happen only in our absence, but with our support. So Masum's leadership and staff are rural. They're women, largely rural, largely women. We do have a city office. It's not the head office. So these are the women who, by being there for one generation, have created role models in the eyes of growing up children. Because children will believe what they see, not what we tell them. And that's why, your earlier question of how we work with young people has become easier. So our rural work is now almost entirely transited over to our rural colleagues. And in transition too, it will go from our rural colleagues, that's our staff, to rural communities who are actually, the owners of those rights. So people are rights bearers and we are only duty holders. So when in doubt, democratize is basically what we believe in.
And how many people have you affected so far?
We work in 3 rural counties, that is about maybe between 250 to 300,000 people is what we work in. In some places health, some places with young people. We do trainings. We are seen as a capacity building organization because of our history of the 1970s where, we learned so much from the peace movement here, the civil rights movement here. We sang the songs here of, and, and in our country, the Dalit rights movement. Do you know one of the first groups, Dalit groups, India organized, and they call themselves Dalit Panthers after the Black Panthers. So, that's how much, we connected with movements all over the world. And so, therefore, Masoom is seen as somebody who brings the politics of that charmed decade of the 70s, but not being dogmatic about the politics of the 70s, but having grown with understanding different identities, like whether it's an LGBT identity or it's disability rights or sex workers' rights. And, people see us as kind of matching the present with the past. So, Masoom, we conduct trainings almost throughout the year. And we never conduct a training on any topic unless we've done a generic course on patriarchy, gender, fundamentalisms, globalization, etc. So we do that whole generic course. Then we come to health or violence or anything like that. So that way I think Masoom continues to touch a lot of people's hearts and gives them courage to realize their own dreams.
Do you think that spirit of the 70s in India is winning? Because we look at the political situation and the political leadership and the people who support the new prime minister and think, well, there's something else that's organizing here that looks a lot different than that.
Yeah, we are getting to be seen more and more as weirdos. They have Joseph Goebbels would say, tell an untruth 100,000 times and it now becomes the truth. So now we are not called secular, we are called pseudo-secular, which means that, when we talk of a diverse India, we are actually hurting the rights of Hindus. Why would anyone go out and hurt the rights of anybody? Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jewish people, Buddhists, Sikhs, all of are equally dear to us. They're all Indians. But we are against any politics that is based on religious chauvinism or cultural nationalism. And so therefore, we obviously will find it more difficult as people start moving from liberal or moderate positions to more right-wing positions. And it's interesting that our, right-wing politicians, on the one hand, will liberalize, will privatize, will globalize, but will want to talk of a culture that was wonderful and beautiful. And it was a wonderful and beautiful culture. But that beauty was its diversity. Jewish people came to our country 2,500 years ago. Christians came to India 2,000 years ago with St. Thomas. As early as the first 12 disciples. Islam came to India almost after the Prophet. And that has been our strength. That has been our diversity. And we don't want that diverse fabric to break down. So we find many more people now who say, oh yes, you've done good work, but now, that doesn't work. And I think that when people stop believing in democracy and when people stop believing in the fact that they can make a change and they want a messiah, that is the beginning of fascism. That's the beginning of totalitarianism. And so we believe that the only alternative to a weak democracy is a strong democracy. It's not dictatorship. So we have a difficult road ahead, but we have complete faith in, change. It just means we have to work harder, we have to work more hours, and we have to, talk to more people. Because everyone, including a fascist, has the right to express his or her opinion. Otherwise, how would I be different from them? But at the same time, we have to keep talking of and showing people that, we can be a much better India if we move into the 21st century with our head held high and the world respecting us, not just having more sweatshops back home, but, also being a very modern nation. And we see that modernity. But those conflicts now will have to be resolved. People can't just have a globalized job and then, be backward in thinking. So modernization, I would say, is when product moves from point A to point B, and modernity is when the mind moves from point A to point B. And I think, we have to walk hand in hand with the whole country.
Manisha Gupte is the co-founder of Masoom, a rural women's organization in the Indian state of Maharashtra. She's been active in the women's movement in India since the 1970s. Thanks a lot for joining us and talking about child marriage in India. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored, and I thank, Saili Joshi. I thank you, I thank the American Jewish World Service for this opportunity to speak to friends here in the United States of America. And I'm sure we'll all work together for individual and global justice together. Thank you.